I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 15 of my series on the JFK assassination. In the spring of 1968, things were not going well for Lyndon Johnson. After telling the American people that the war in Vietnam was going fine and that victory was just around the corner, the Viet Cong had launched massive military strikes all across South Vietnam that came to be known as the Tet Offensive, which showed Americans that victory was not right around the corner and that this war was likely to go on for a long time. At the same time, there were massive anti-war protests against Johnson, very nasty ones directed personally at him oftentimes. One of the popular chants was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many babies have you killed today?" And they were referring to the massive bombing campaign that Johnson and the military had launched against North Vietnam. At the same time, Johnson's political affairs were running into difficulty. And we know that by virtue of what happened in March of 1968. That was the New Hampshire primary. In that primary, the anti-war senator, Eugene McCarthy from Wisconsin, enters the race in New Hampshire. And he ends up getting 40% of the vote. Stunned America. I mean, here was 40% of vote against an incumbent by somebody within his own party. And within a couple of days after that, Robert Kennedy enters the race. Here's the brother of the deceased president. And so Johnson, about 2 weeks later, goes on national television and announces that he has suddenly and unexpectedly decided to drop out of the race. He says he's going to use the rest of his administration to work on peace in Vietnam. He was going to become a statesman. Now, ever since then, the mainstream historians and the mainstream reporters, mainstream media have said that, Johnson was just discouraged. He realized he might lose this political race, and he just didn't want to face the humiliation of going through that kind of defeat, and therefore he decided to just go ahead and drop out and work for peace, become a statesman. Well, that's possible. But it just goes against the grain of everything we know about Lyndon Johnson. I mean, Johnson was a political fighter. There is nothing to indicate that he would ever fear anybody, much less Eugene McCarthy, who he considered just sort of a nothing in terms of political competition. And he hated Bobby Kennedy. I hated him with a passion, and the feeling was mutual. The thought that Johnson would just suddenly raise the white flag against Bobby Kennedy, it just doesn't make any sense. When Johnson was 28 years old, there was a special congressional election in his district, and he decides to enter the race. And all the powers that be there said, "Lyndon, wait your turn. You're going to get defeated. You're going to cost yourself a lot of support for the future. It's their turn," referring to very prominent, influential people that were running. I think there was like 30-something people running in the special election. And Johnson said, to heck with them all. And he runs and he wins. So he takes these insurmountable odds and he wins because he was a masterful politician and he knew it. Now, when he ran for U.S. Senate the first time in Texas, it was the same thing. You had, I think it was a special election, but it was a large number of people running. And Johnson decides to enter the race. And everybody tells him, you're going to hurt yourself, wait your turn. And he's running against all these prominent, influential people, and he loses, but he only loses by a little bit. But the point is that he didn't fear any of those people. And then when he runs for U.S. Senate in 1948, he takes on one of the most popular governors in the history of Texas, and that's a man named Coke Stevenson, highly admired, highly respected. And Johnson said, "I'll take him on." And Johnson wins the race. Well, sort of. Johnson actually lost the race, but he got a crony in South Texas to keep his ballot box open. It became known as the infamous Box 13. And so as soon as everybody else's ballot stations had closed across the state, Johnson was losing by 200 or 300 votes or something. And so he called his buddy up and said, "I need some extra votes." And so They had them write them in the same ink and the same handwriting. You can attest to this in Robert Cairo's books on Lyndon Johnson, his biographies. And so Johnson ends up winning by about 87 votes, I think. And I mean, nobody's ever going to suggest that Johnson wasn't as crooked as a dog hind's leg. I mean, the guy was as crooked as they come. In fact, on the very day of the assassination, a lot of people don't know this, but he was very close to being criminally prosecuted, to being indicted for, and of course removed from office. And there were rumors that the Kennedys wanted to dump him anyway, so the criminal prosecution would have provided them a perfect excuse to do that. But he was embroiled with a man named Billy Saul Estes, who was being accused of agricultural fraud in Texas, a good friend of Lyndon's, and he ultimately got convicted and got sent to the penitentiary. In fact, an interesting sidelight of the Billy Saul Estes case is that a federal official went down to investigate the agricultural fraud, and he was on a ranch down in Texas, and his body was found riddled with bullets, and the local authorities there decreed that this was a suicide. And then there was another man named Bobby Baker who was embroiled in corruption, a vending machine scandal with payoffs and things on military bases. And he was Johnson's right-hand man when Johnson was a majority leader. So as they were tightening the noose on Bobby Baker and on Billy Saul Estes, the idea was they were going to flip and turn on Johnson for a better deal. And so on the very day of the assassination, there is a congressional hearing on the Baker matter that the witness was about to embroil Johnson in, and as soon as the assassination hits, that hearing got canceled, never got resumed. In fact, Life magazine, which was the premier weekly magazine in America at the time, it planned to devote its November 29th issue, 1963, to the corruption that Lyndon had been engaged in. And that got canceled with the assassination and was never published after Johnson became president. Also, according to Cairo, there were two newspapers in Texas who had investigative journalists working on the corruption in which Johnson had allegedly been involved in with Baker and Billy Saul Estes. And Johnson telephoned those two newspapers after he was elected and said, "Shut it down or I'll sick the IRS and regulatory bureaucrats on you," and they shut it down. So Johnson was not your paragon of virtue, as crooked as they come in terms of politics, but also as fearless and as masterful as they come in politics. So the idea that Johnson's going to run scared in terms of these two races, it goes against everything we know about Lyndon Johnson. Now, someone might say, well, but Jacob, he gets 40% of the vote. I mean, that's a large vote. That's enough to discourage anybody when he's the incumbent. Well, except for one thing. Johnson's name wasn't on the ballot. That's right. He got 49% of the vote. He beat McCarthy in New Hampshire. And his name wasn't even on the ballot. So how's that possible? That's how many people wrote his name in. 49% of the electorate wrote Johnson's name in. Now, Johnson he hadn't formally entered the New Hampshire primary. He's the incumbent. He figured, McCarthy's a gnat. I'm not going to bother with it. Now, as soon as the results are in, Johnson realizes he has a fight. And then Bobby Kennedy enters the race. Johnson realizes he has a fight. Now, this is where it's make or break time. Now he has to start getting galvanized. And he does. He puts his campaign team together. He sends him to Wisconsin, which is, within a couple of weeks, the next primary. Now, there's something else to know about this, that the primaries in 1968 had just a very small number of delegates involved. The lion's share of the delegates were controlled by the party bosses. And those party bosses had their allegiance with Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson could win the race even if he started losing primaries. But the point is, why not try? Why not try another primary or another primary? Because the New Hampshire primary really wasn't any kind of test at all, since Johnson did not campaign there and didn't have his name on the ballot. So it would make sense that Johnson would get galvanized after this, which he did. In fact, he even told somebody, "I'll be darned if I'm going to let anybody tear my legislative record apart." So he's getting galvanized. Now, keep this in mind too. Remember the Clark report. That was that third meeting that the Justice Department had called. They had made it look like Boswell had called it, but clearly it was Johnson that did this, and because they keep it secret. And Johnson's clearly going to use this as his ace in the hole, so that when the assassination comes up, which is a virtual certainty now with Bobby Kennedy's entry into the race, that Johnson had planned, well, I've got this report from these prominent, influential, competent, famous pathologists showing you that this was all just conspiracy theories. And so that indicates that all the way up through February, late February 1968, right before the New Hampshire primary, this man is still running for office, for re-election. And he loved to be president. I mean, this was his driving ambition in life. The thought that he would cut and run just because he runs into a little difficulty in the New Hampshire primary just doesn't make much sense. So, but that's the explanation. That's the official explanation. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But I think there's another logical explanation here. Now, that explanation lies in the criminal trial that we discussed in an earlier episode. That was the trial that was brought in January of '69, where the District Attorney of New Orleans is bringing a criminal prosecution against a man named Clay Shaw, in which he is alleging that the assassination was a highly sophisticated, highly complex national security state regime change operation and cover-up. And as part of that trial, Lieutenant Colonel Fink is testifying. And he's one of the three pathologists who conducted the autopsy. Now, you'll recall that when the prosecuting attorney started asking him about the neck wound, did you dissect the neck wound? Fink was doing everything he could not to answer the question. And the prosecutor kept probing and probing and probing. Now, keep in mind here something. The prosecutors have no idea of the shenanigans that went on with the autopsy. Up to this point, the military has succeeded in keeping the autopsy encased in secrecy concrete. Nothing has leaked out. Sandra Spencer's testimony, the Galler's funeral home report, all the things we've discussed here, they were kept secret. So the prosecutor's just probing. And so he hits on something where it looks like Fink's vulnerable because Fink doesn't want to answer the question. Well, finally Fink says, the reason I didn't do it is I was ordered not to. Now think about that for a moment. Here you have three military pathologists who have come together to conduct this autopsy. But it's clear from that answer that they are not the ones in charge of this autopsy. You would ordinarily think the pathologist is in charge of the autopsy. If Dr. Earl Rose at Parkland Hospital had been permitted to conduct the autopsy, he would have been in charge of the autopsy. Here, somebody else is in charge, or some structure is in charge. Now, before you say, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory, keep in mind, this is Fink's testimony. This is he who has said this, that somebody has said, stay away from that neck wound, and he has complied with that order. So somebody has something in mind. When they're saying, don't do this, don't deal with that wound, they have something in mind. They're orchestrating something. They're directing something. And we can see the direction from what we now know by virtue of Sandra Spencer's testimony, that there was one set of photographs that showed the reality, the back of the head wound, a massive exit wound, and then, of course, the bogus photographs that show the back of the wound to be intact. Somebody is orchestrating this thing, and for a reason. Is there any other evidence of this? Absolutely. The enlisted men who later would reveal that they brought in the president's body in a shipping casket, that happened at 6:35 p.m., earlier than the 8 p.m. official entry time in the front of the facility where the morgue was located. Those men, when they were finally released from their vows of secrecy in the mid-1970s, said that the shipping casket arrived in a great big black automobile, like a hearse, and that in this automobile there were men in suits. Who were those men? We don't know. We don't know if they were CIA, Secret Service, Navy intelligence, whoever. All we know is that there were men in suits that were bringing this shipping casket there. How did that happen? How did they know to go get the shipping casket? How did they know where to deliver it? The only way they can do that is that somebody overall, some structure, some consortium is there directing and managing this affair. Now, in order to do this is a highly complex operation, obviously. It's got a lot of moving parts to it. These people have to be very smart. It's almost a necessity. When you're going to run something this complex, they got to be smart. And they know that when Johnson is now faced with Bobby Kennedy's entry of the race, things have gotten very dangerous. They know what Johnson did, that the assassination and the autopsy were probably going to be issues in this campaign. Especially with Bobby Kennedy's entry into the race. But the international press was always skeptical of the official story, and the international press would be covering a presidential election. And a presidential election is like war. You don't know. You can't predict how things are going to work out. Suppose Sandra Spencer secretly leaks to the press that she developed a set of photographs, autopsy photographs, that showed the massive exit wound in the back of President Kennedy's head, which would corroborate what the Dallas doctors and the Dallas nurses and Secret Service Clint Hill and the bystanders behind the automobile said, and many of the Bethesda witnesses would say. That, what if somebody in Gawler's funeral home, liked Bobby Kennedy and decided to release to the press on a confidential basis the written report that would come out in the 1990s, the Gawler's report that said the president's body was brought in a shipping casket? What if Sergeant Boyajian decides to leak his report that he kept for 30 years? Suppose he secretly leaks it to the press, showing that his team of Marines brought in the president's body at 6:35 p.m. Suppose the x-ray technician that was developing the x-rays on President Kennedy's head and said that he was walking in the main foyer when Mrs. Kennedy was walking in, and the casket from Dallas that supposedly contained the president's body was out in front, when he said he had the x-rays of the president's head in his hand, which would indicate that Dallas casket was empty and the president's body was downstairs in the morgue. All of this could happen in a presidential campaign. And remember, up to this time, all of this was encased in secrecy concrete. These people had to know the dangers involved here, and they figured they could not take a risk. Now, Johnson had prepared for this. He's got the false inventory from the first meeting at the National Archives. He's got the recertification from the autopsy pathologist. He's got the Clark panel. That's his secret ace in the hole. He's kept it secret up to this point. But these guys, they're not dumb. They know the risks here, and it boggles the mind that they would say, let's go ahead and roll the dice. What's the point? So my hunch is that they march into Johnson's office and they say, Lyndon, you have had a good run here. You've had 6 years in the presidency. You've fulfilled your life's ambition, your driving obsession. You've had a good run. It's too dangerous at this point. It's time for you to retire back to your ranch in Texas. And Johnson could face down Bobby Kennedy. He could face down Eugene McCarthy. He could face down any politician, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, what have you. He could not face the power of this structure, especially knowing that both of them were embroiled up to the top of their heads in this fraudulent autopsy. And I think that's the logical explanation as to why Johnson suddenly and unexpectedly drops out of the race and decides to become a statesman working for peace in the war that he had launched. What happened to that secret ace in the hole, that Clark panel report? Well, interestingly enough, Johnson ended up using it as an ace in the hole anyway, in a very interesting way.